Good morning and welcome to day 4 of the talk series. It is the last day of just the talk series. Don't worry, we've got 2 more days of games. I swear I'm going to start doing that. So we're kicking off today with a panel on diversity in games presented by SAE. Thank you so much for organizing this, Glenn. It's a very important subject and I'm really excited to hear from you all. It's so cool. For the rest of the day, we have a bunch of people that are flying in to be here. So I know all of your heads are probably hurting from the game dev meetup last night, but it's going to be worth it. Come on down, watch in person. Otherwise, make sure you're tuning in on the live stream. SAE is one of our major sponsors. This event couldn't happen without them. So also thank you so much for that. And I'll let you take it away.
Thanks very much. I'm Glenn Spores, and I'll just play the obligatory video just before we start. Yes, I. Okay, yeah, thanks for all coming. I'm Glenn Spores. I'm just here on behalf of SAE, and I'm just moderating this panel. We also have 3 lovely guests who are named there, but who we will quickly introduce. So each in your turn, if you would like to introduce yourselves.
My name's Sarah Jade. I come from academic background in games. I did a wonderful exegesis on the social experiences of women and non-binary gamers in toxic gamer culture, and I've made some other stuff too. Yeah.
Hey, I'm Lisa. I'm a game artist. I'm currently contracting. I've worked in the industry about 15 years for all sorts of cool companies, and yeah, excited to talk about diversity, and I'm really positive about it.
My name's Megan. I come from a science education background where I was using games in the classroom, went into academia, did some research around games, now freelance as a games user researcher, so all that playtesting goodness, and work in tech on the side as a UX designer / researcher.
Cool, thanks. I'm obviously the least diverse member of the panel. I'm just representing the aged compared to the youthful effervescence of the people to my right. So hopefully I won't be talking too much, it'll mostly be you folks. So we're breaking up the panel into just 3 rough sections, talking about sort of player experiences, then developer experiences, then thinking about strategies to foster diversity in games. So we should probably jump straight into, yes, player experiences of diversity. So I suppose to start off with, the question is, what is diversity in games and why is it an issue?
Diversity in games encompasses many things, and I think it all comes down to representation. And people need to see themselves in games as a player or as a developer or anywhere. Representation, I've lost that train of thought.
Well, I think we know from like other forms of media, representation has a big impact on the audience, and so just the same goes for games. And I think the types of people who make games, typically that audience hasn't been particularly diverse, and so that like carries through into the games that are made.
Yeah, and also just about avoiding negative stereotypes as well. Like you get horrendous stereotypes, particularly for sexuality and certain ethnicities and religions. So having a spotlight put on those things to avoid them and make it a more comfortable experience for everyone playing is super important.
So yeah, what's the consequences in terms of not having diversity of games? And obviously we've got a very strongly male heritage tradition of gaming, so what's the consequences of not being diverse?
The consequences of no diversity are you get games made by straight white men for straight white men, and that's about it. That's the most succinct way to put it.
The middle image there, your default white male, yeah.
Or people who are on the fence and go, oh, I think I might like to play games, they go, oh, actually this isn't for me, because they can't see themselves either in the games or in the audience of people playing the games. And I think that's like esports is kind of falling, like seeing the fruits of that, in that you're just not seeing yourself represented, so you go, oh, well, maybe I don't belong there, even though there's no reason why there should be like a gender split in terms of like being a top competitive player.
There's something to be said about when you have low representation, what that creates, I think, is a self-fulfilling prophecy, or like a feedback loop which feeds itself. And so I'm going to use women in tech as an example of no diversity. You don't see women in tech, and so it builds a mindset that women aren't interested in tech. And so then people don't want to get into tech, and then you don't see women in tech, and then you don't...
And it can start as early as like primary school age children. Like they just absorb this culture, and like they just know, they might not be able to articulate it, but they just notice it. And so there was this great study where they asked like you have 6-year-olds to draw a scientist, and they would draw the stereotype, old white guy in a lab coat. And I know it's not games, but the same thing, principle applies. And you know, you have to sort of actively work against that, or at least try and like show them diversity, to show that you can be anything, instead of them sort of narrowing their view. And it happens earlier than you think, just unintentionally.
Feel free to grab one. Just swipe it.
It's probably worthwhile then just thinking, what are some specific examples you can remember from growing up where you felt excluded and weren't represented, as well as examples of when you first felt represented in games?
I'll tell a quick funny story from a few years ago. We were at PAX in Melbourne, and we wanted to go try Zero Latency, which is the VR like free roaming place, which is now here in Perth as well. And there was about 6 or 7 of us, however many you can fit in a game. It was a zombie shoot 'em up game. And you don't get to choose your avatar or anything, but you can see each other in the game world, so you don't bump into one another. And we were all soldiers, and we were all dudes, and it was just, because half of us were women, it was just hilarious to look over, and kind of like took me a bit out of the experience. I'm like, some random black buff soldier dude, and it was like my girlfriend, it's like standing over there. That was just a bit weird for me.
I had the exact same experience at Zero Latency. So
No, nothing from me on that one.
So in terms of, yeah, like first experiences when you were playing games, did you have notable moments where you really felt that the culture wasn't speaking to you?
Being transgender, that's a way more loaded question than you think. That's it.
Yeah.
Because if I was to relate to your experience with the zero latency, like that might have been a very different experience for me, because there's some weird disconnect when I was looking and seeing guy avatars and then turning out to be transgender later. So that's why it's a way more loaded question than you think.
I think like we should say it depends on the game. Like if the game's main character is a character and you're playing as that character and there's a story involving this character, that's quite different from a game where you have an avatar and you have control over the like what the avatar looks like, and you kind of, I have this like version of myself I like to put as the avatar, so I'll do like colorful hair and just like other random bits and pieces, and that's just how I like to look in a game. And if I can't do that, like often there will be games, and some of them are really random Nintendo games where I can't have colorful hair, and I'm like, oh. And I know that's like a really minor thing, but there are a lot of games where you can control your avatar and you can't even choose to be a woman. You can only be a guy, like as an example, or the female characters have like really revealing clothes and they just don't have normal armor sets, or you know, like things like that. That sort of makes me go, oh, I see what kind of game this is, like, or I see what kind of people made this game, and I kind of feel like it's not aimed at me.
Yeah, I think for sure. I'll be going over some of this when I get into my character creator sort of talk as well. But yeah, it's often about like can you see yourself? Can other people see you? And how important is that to your story? Like, I think there's nothing wrong with having RPGs where you're inhabiting the body of someone else and sort of, because you do get that empathy and that understanding of that character. And so I think having those games where you have different kinds of main characters to play as are also really important. But you do also need a diversity of main characters for that to happen.
I think there's something to be said for games literally telling their story better when you're experiencing the story as you would have if you're playing a character that you feel is more you. So there's definitely, on one hand, you're playing a predetermined story with a predetermined character. And you literally build more of a connection and more investment in the story when you feel more like you're making those decisions than playing yourself. Like, the game is literally better for it.
Like, I cried at the end of Witcher 3 because I got the bad ending because of one thing, like one choice I made like maybe 20 minutes prior, and I was like, oh no. And like, that was playing as Geralt, you know, it was completely opposite to me in real life, but like, I really liked that, playing as that character.
I mean, player choices can also kind of weigh into that. Like, can you role play as yourself? Can you physically make choices which reflect who you are as a person when you're making choices for the character in the game?
Or if you just did what you thought Geralt would do.
Do you think the proliferation of all the fictional options within, you know, fantasy races and so on, how do you think that overlaps with the real identities that you're trying to experience in games? So how do they work with or against one another, do you think?
Oh, it's really early, Glenn.
Yeah, when you get into, you know, Tolkien Lord of the Rings style, you know, when you realize what those awkward, you know, relations are between the races in Lord of the Rings and what they're based on, you go, oh, this is awkward now. I don't like this. So, yeah.
So in a lot of the more contemporary role-playing games where they go beyond the Tolkien stereotypes, do you feel like those fictional races lead into people being a bit more comfortable role-playing other than themselves and experimenting a bit more, or that's not so much the case?
I think it can go either way depending on the intention with which you choose that character, because you can, you know, we can't stop players from, you know, choosing a character design that doesn't match their ethnicity and then acting up, right? But not having that ability to choose is a problem. So it's always going to be a bit of a tricky thing to navigate. But we can choose how we portray our NPCs, how we portray our enemies in games, and like, if you've chosen an ethnicity for a person who is a bad person in your game, why, and how are you navigating not portraying that bad personality as that related to their race?
So, as a particular example, when you turn on Skyrim and you go through your character creation and you make it look however you want to look or be in that world. That's all well and good, but regardless of what character you create, the next 20 minutes of gameplay, all you meet is muscly white dudes and maybe one woman, and there's a subtle undertext there that the game, like, regardless of how you're presenting your character, the game has assumed its target audience is a white male, and I think that's an example of a much more subtle example of things. Like, it gets away with it because you still created your character the way you wanted to, and so everything else sort of slides under the radar.
The Australia Plays was only released a few weeks ago, and a couple of us attended. Jeff Brand released the survey data, and a lot of that was just emphasising that a lot more people in Australia are playing games, especially post-COVID. So we're seeing more diversity in the actual audience of people playing games. And amongst those, we did find that most of the people were seeking diversity in the games they played. So do you really feel that the games have caught up with changes in the culture? And obviously a lot of this is bearing on the fact that it's an important mass medium that's influencing a lot of people. So, yeah, to what extent do you feel that the game is reflecting the culture and the people playing?
Historically, games has been about 5 to 10 years behind the rest of the shifting going on in mainstream culture. It was about, I'd say, a good decade behind like waves of feminism that were happening in like mainstream media. So games does follow, but it is slow too. And that is becoming more and more of an issue when we see games shifting more to be closer to that mainstream medium. Like games is way more mainstream than it used to be.
But I think in Australia, we're primarily indie and smaller studio space. That area, we're seeing a lot more diverse and different games come through a bit quicker. I think AAA studios are probably still a bit behind in some cases, but there's some fantastic, and I think we're seeing definitely more investment and more creation of different kinds of games that aren't just either RPGs or action adventure or shooters. So we've got some great Australian games like Unpacking, you know, and even like made by diverse teams that are a little bit different from those sort of more mainstream AAA genres. And so it'd be great to see, and I'm really excited about seeing more of those come through. One that's not Australian but got released recently, Vemba, is about like cooking and rediscovering lost recipes from your grandmother, and they migrated to Canada, but they're from India, so it's like connecting with culture, and that represents the team who made it, their personal experiences. So we're seeing more of those games, and they're more commercially successful. So I think that will then beget more games like that, because people will go, actually, this can be a successful game, even though it's a bit out of the ordinary compared to what we're used to in the past. So I'm hoping that we'll see more of those games start to come through.
I also just want to note that it's just data like that's so important, because the more vocal people are about wanting more representation, the companies will eventually listen. I mean, we all hope, but diversity doesn't happen if voices aren't loud enough.
And we also vote with our wallets, so we buy the games that we see that have great diversity and are exciting. So yeah, that's another way to push changes. Make sure that you're spending your dollars where it counts.
You mentioned Australian games. I suppose Indigenous culture is something that certainly is underrepresented in mainstream games. What's been your experience, if any, of Indigenous representation in games?
I've actually worked for a group called Bilby Labs recently over the last year, and they've been trying to create basically a recreation of all of these Indigenous sites across Australia before colonisation. And their aim is to create basically an MMO where you can roleplay as an Indigenous person and experience all sorts of culture and cultural heritage through their program. So yeah, they are out there. They are out there.
There was a game that was just released, Broken
Roads?
Broken Roads. That I know that was released, and there was consultation with Indigenous communities. Do you know any of the people involved in that? Or?
Yeah, what's that? Amos? Amos, yeah. Amos was involved with coding that, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Which is, a good trend to generally see more of that happening. I suppose if we're looking at that demographic data, I suppose there's probably not enough info about how many Indigenous people are actually playing those games to therefore try and get more accurate representation. And there's always those problems of how you represent Australianness or Indigenous culture and who are you doing it for.
I think I met with Lee from Screen Australia the other day, this week, and he was saying that they have these guidelines for TV and movies around how they incorporate that culture, especially if you want to, or liaise and engage with those people